Any old time. Cut the music, and they'll start the timer when you talk. I won't eat into your time. I'm Roger Strugoff. Again, for everyone who's joining us live, conference chair, and we've reached the top of the hour again. And we are going to have Jim Donovan from Wasabi. We are going to have David Friend, the CEO, but he's been delayed, has flight delays, so we accept Jim. It's going to be all right. He leads the product team. He's a veteran of Oracle, a company you've probably heard of, and many other enterprise tech companies in the Boston area. And as I said before, the sessions we've had here have been very interesting because they're sort of changing perceptions of a lot of big topics. Well, when it comes down to it, there's probably no bigger topic than storage. So Jim is here to talk about cloud storage, a cheap, fast, standardized utility. Take it away.
Excellent. Thank you, Roger, for that fine introduction. So sorry, my colleague and boss, David Friend's not here today. He got tied up in some flight due to the weather. But so you're stuck with me, so we'll try to make the best of it over the next half hour or so. So today we want to talk a little bit about cloud storage and the evolution of cloud storage to become a commoditized utility. And some of the drivers for this development really are based on the ongoing data tsunami that's taking place in terms of, if you look at one of the analyst firms, IDC, if you look at today, the worldwide data aggregation is probably around 40 zettabytes. That's going to increase 4 to 5 times by the time 2025 comes around. So certainly this is an important market and business driver for the commoditization of cloud storage. Another important driver is what we describe as the great migration to cloud storage. And if you look at Gartner's analysts in terms of how many businesses are doing something with cloud storage today, they're estimating between 25 and 30%. You know, for those of you representing enterprises today, are your companies doing anything with cloud storage? Can I get a hands raised for anybody doing cloud storage today? Okay, so probably not quite the Gartner 25 to 30%, but that's no surprise. But Gartner is also predicting in the next 4 to 5 years that over 80% of the businesses will start to embrace cloud storage in one form or another. And for those of you that sat through David from Deloitte's cloud talk at 2 o'clock, you recognize that certainly there's a greater embrace of all things cloud, computing, storage, and those sorts of things going forward. So that's a big driver for what we're doing here at Wasabi. And just as a way of introducing my company to you, Wasabi's mission is really focused on providing low price, insanely fast public cloud storage. So our product is Cloud Object Storage as a Service. It's in the same class of products as Amazon Web Services S3, Microsoft Azure's Blob Storage, and Google Cloud Platform Storage Service. So our focus is really on providing the lowest cost, best performing, most secure utility cloud storage on the market today. So one of the drivers for the work we do is certainly the trend towards commoditization around storage. And certainly when you ask the question, what makes a commodity, it really does come down to standards. And standards are defined in a whole bunch of different categories. There's size. When we talk about utilities, it's tempting to talk about electricity and voltage in terms of, in North America, you have one standard. In Europe, you have other standards. Gasoline, in terms of octane, is a standard. Connectors, in terms of how you interface into various services and elements, is certainly a standard. As it pertains to cloud storage, you'll hear us talk a lot about APIs, or application programming interfaces. So let's give you some specific examples of that. So when you think about electricity in terms of it's a standard size commodity regardless of provider. So in where I live in the Boston area, I can get electricity from 4 or 5 different providers. It's always the same size. It always comes through the same outlet. So this is really an analogy for where we believe cloud storage is going as well. So in terms of, you have providers you're purchasing from it today, but that may change over time as the storage product becomes more and more commoditized. So Wasabi's prediction, in fact, our mission is really about making cloud storage a commodity. So like electricity, we believe in one size fits all with a standardized API. You'll hear us talk a lot about the S3 API over the course of the next half hour or so. So one of the challenges, or among the challenges, holding the commoditization of cloud storage back does come down to cost in terms of if you look at the current cost of public cloud storage today, and if you use Amazon Web Services S3 service as an industry benchmark, that costs about $23 a terabyte per month. So if you compare that to the ownership costs of tape or forms of paper storage, when you do all the math, it's not a tremendous savings relative to just keeping it in the format that it's in today. So for many enterprises, they've not made the move to cloud storage because the economics just haven't been there. So certainly that's a challenge in evolving storage to become a commoditized service. The other challenge you have is the sizes, and in terms of when I talked earlier about the electricity analogy and how you have this simple concept of no matter where you are in North America, the electricity is always the same voltage, always comes in the same outlet form. With storage today, from the big three hyperscalers like Microsoft Azure, Amazon Web Services, and Google Cloud Platform, you have every one of those providers offers 4 or 5 different flavors of cloud storage. And for those of you that haven't really dug too deeply into it, it can be quite a challenge for your typical storage buyer because they don't know if they need near line, cold line, glacier, and frequent access one zone, reduced redundancy. It can be overwhelming. So certainly this kind of goes against the spirit of what you see taking place when you're talking about the commoditization of anything. And lastly, there has been some challenges over the years in the commoditization of cloud storage as it pertains to API usage. Now, I can tell you that over the past couple years, there's been an increased adoption of Amazon Web Services S3 API. So this was something that Amazon pioneered over 10 years ago. And you have all the major storage vendors, Dell EMC, NetApp, everybody that's selling storage today has some capabilities in that regard. So that's really driving one important trend in the standardization around storage and from it becoming a commodity. Probably about the only challenge is if you look at Microsoft Azure's blob storage service, they still have their own proprietary API, which is great if you're staying entirely within the Microsoft Office 365 and other Microsoft product ecosystem, but it does pose some challenges if you're trying to make your existing storage environment work with a Microsoft Azure blob storage environment today. So certainly that's among the trends. So when it comes to like some of the other industry trends, in terms of you look at gasoline as an example, gasoline comes from hundreds of different suppliers. It all comes with a standard interface. When you go to your gas station, you have a standard pump interface regardless of a provider. So we'd like to think that's the trend in the evolution we're going to get to from a cloud storage perspective. So one of the challenges we sometimes get asked about in terms of, because our direct competitors, our top 3 competitors are Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, and Google Cloud Platform. So why would anyone want to start a company where you have to fight against those 3 every single day? So the good news is, from a market opportunity perspective, is we like to say the dog will eat the dog food in terms of, when we talked earlier about the increasing demand for all types of storage. And it means that the investment that we're making in building this business, ultimately there's a market for what we build. And that's proven out in the fact that we've had our service live for 18 months. We're over 6,000 customers. We recently raised almost $70 million in a Series B. So it's been a very successful business journey for us so far. The fact that the markets are very large in terms of the Amazon Web Services S3 service reportedly is between a $4 and $5 billion business just on the S3 storage piece of it alone. So we know that there's gold in them our hills, as they say. And then lastly, we do think that some of the near monopolies that Amazon Web Services and others have right now in the cloud infrastructure, certainly it's vulnerable to massive disruption. And if you look at Amazon Web Services S3 in particular, the service really hasn't changed too much over time. So it's something that we are already 6 times faster than Amazon Web Services from a write speed perspective. So we think that there's an opportunity for disruption, certainly from a price perspective, but also from a performance perspective as well. And if you look at over the past several decades, there's been a number of examples where established competitors, I think one of our CEO's favorite ones he likes to talk about is United States Steel. And I have enough gray in my hair to remember this company, and in that it was founded almost 150 years ago. And in the 70s, they really went hard with a younger competitor known as Nucor. And Nucor was kind of like the wasabi of the steel industry in terms of they came out with a lower price product. They were able to deliver it to their customers in a lot faster than the incumbent could do. And essentially what's taken place over time is that 5 years ago, United States Steel was removed from the Standard & Poor's index just because they were no longer profitable as a company. Now, certainly we're not going to predict that outcome for Amazon Web Services, but it just shows you an example of the disruption that can take place in the market when you have a smaller competitor come out with a product that's lower priced and offers improved performance. Another example that those of you with gray hair like myself might remember are the battles of AT&T and their competitors over time. So, I remember as a teenager, when you wanted to call long distance, you had to do it after a certain time of night because it was a lot cheaper when you wanted to do that. And if you remember when MCI came out, they came out with some pretty provocative advertising and disruptive pricing that essentially put AT&T on a path to, as a standalone company before the days of mobile telephony, where their market value kept going down. In 1984, they had 90% market share. Basically, 1999, it went down to 40%, and in 2005, they were acquired by Southwestern Bell, and Southwestern Bell was eventually ended up reclaiming the AT&T name. So this is kind of a tale for one to remember in terms of the battle between the big established incumbent and when a smaller provider comes out that's able to drive the commoditization of a product and make long distance a commodity product. So very much like what Wasabi is trying to do in the public cloud storage space. So kind of one of the lessons learned for everyone in this regard is that it's less about worrying about what your competitors can't do and focus on what they won't do. In the case of U.S. Steel or AT&T, they were very inflexible on their pricing and ultimately resulted in their demise. So if you look at what we're trying to do with Wasabi in driving the cost of cloud storage down to become a commodity, this is something that we don't really expect what Amazon and Azure and GCP are going to do because it's such an important part of their business, and we think that it's going to be a challenge for them to embrace the commoditization of it just because it's a very profitable service for them. Another kind of industry example to think about as it pertains to Wasabi and some of the competitors we work with today, if you remember the battles between IBM and Apple in the 1980s, in terms of, we all remember the geeky looking guy that looked a lot like me. He was always a PC guy, and there was some cool slick kid that kind of looked like Steve Jobs pitching the Apple products. And one of my favorite commercials of all time, and I would encourage you to kind of Google it and watch it again because it's actually only been shown on live TV once. This was the Apple 1984 Super Bowl ad. It was actually produced by one of my favorite directors, Ridley Scott, and it's just a moving commercial. And it really kind of the takeaway is that you have these established incumbents that are relatively inflexible in terms of what they're delivering from a technology perspective and a price perspective, and then you have a young upstart come out, and ultimately what you see happening in the case of IBM versus Apple, one might argue that Apple is now the established incumbent and very hard to displace, and as a family that held a whole bunch of iDevices, I certainly get that, but it's kind of an example of the opportunity to disrupt an existing competitor, and that's certainly what Wasabi is trying to do in the cloud storage space. So when you think about Wasabi, and we kind of try the same sort of approach that Apple has done with some of our advertising in terms of, you want tube socks, fast and cheap, go to Amazon. You want your cloud storage, fast and cheap, go to Wasabi. And that's a big part of what we're doing, and that's been part of our success in growing our business. Another example might be is that how to figure out egress fees in terms of the key is don't pay any, because for those of you that have looked at public cloud storage today, all the existing big three hyperscales will charge you fees to get your data out of their storage service. David from Deloitte was talking about that earlier, about the impact of data egress fees. And we actually think that's silly at Wasabi, because if you're trying to get someone to adopt more of your storage and then you charge them to pull the data out, that just inherently creates some business friction. So one of the basic attributes of the work we're doing in Wasabi in terms of trying to commoditize cloud storage is getting rid of those types of fees in terms of egress fees and API calls or anything that causes business friction around the increased usage of your storage service. So why does this matter to you? So when you take a look at again, this kind of comes back to the volume of data that's growing. If you look at email alone, in terms of over 600 million emails are sent every single day, that's over almost 3,000 petabytes of storage annually. If you take a look at the body camera or surveillance industry in terms of how much data is produced out of that environment. Just think about body cameras in a police context in terms of one of the kind of the clever things that's happening right now is that if you look at Axon Taser, one of the leading manufacturers in this space, in terms of they're essentially giving the cameras away to these different police departments, knowing that they'll make the money back on massive amounts of cloud storage revenue. Axon Taser charges close to $100 a terabyte per month for this storage. We charge about $5 a terabyte per month. So it just shows the opportunity for disruption, and you think about the volume of storage getting created out of all the different surveillance activities that are taking place today. It's a huge driver for why you should care about what we're doing at Wasabi. Genomics data in terms of, about 40,000 petabytes a year getting created within 5 years in terms of all the data that's collected from research and where are you going to store that all. You need a very cost-effective, commoditized approach to storing that data. The Large Hadron Collider in terms of 14 million pictures per second, that you're talking about exabytes worth of data every single week coming out of that environment. There's a new telescope project that just broke ground in April of this year called the Square Kilometer Array. So imagine a telescope environment that 1 square kilometers of dishes in Australia and South Africa. You're talking about an exabyte of data per day. Okay, the massive amounts of data associated with it. So again, that's a driver for the commoditization that we're working on at Wasabi. Lastly, in terms of you look at the data generated by the Internet of Things space, in terms of you're talking about 600 zettabytes per year by 2020. And then if you aggregate all that up, you're talking between 35 and 40 zettabytes by 2020. That's over 50 times the data that was stored in 2010. So again, massive growth in data storage. And for us, the drive towards storage as a utility, it's really based on making one size fits all. So at Wasabi, for example, we don't have different storage tiers. We have hot storage at cold storage prices. And we think that's one of the most disruptive things that we're doing as a means of marching towards the commoditization of cloud storage as a service. Simple, predictable pricing, and I'll give you some examples of that. And for our customers that are maintaining these fairly costly and antiquated storage premises environments, we're encouraging them to give the cloud a good hard look, because certainly it's going to give you cost savings advantages you're not able to attain with your premises storage environment today. So how does this change everything? So things that were uneconomical to store before are all of a sudden a lot more economical than you've been able to achieve in the past, and we'll give you some specific examples of that. So we talked about price in terms of if you're thinking about, let's just say you want to store a petabyte of data, for example. You can store a petabyte of data with Wasabi for about $60,000 a year. If you try to do that with Amazon, Microsoft Azure, or GCP, you typically 5 times or greater amount per data. And a lot of this comes down from not only on a cost per terabyte or petabyte stored basis, but the fact that we don't charge you for data egress fees. We don't charge you for API charges. And this API charge is another kind of clever way of kind of taxing you for more usage of your storage. So every time you do a write to that storage, every time you do a read from that storage, you have to pay fractions of a penny. And sometimes you have applications that might be pounding away with these thousands of API requests per second. So we have some customers that 30% of their bill from Amazon ends up just being associated with these API charges. So this is a meaningful difference in terms of what we're doing at Wasabi relative to the big 3 hyperscalers. If you ever play around with the Amazon Web Services calculator, for example, typically it has between 25 and 30 entries you have to put in as a means of trying to figure out your bill. So in terms of when David from Deloitte was up there talking about earlier about getting these $1,000 bills for leaving services on and things like that, that's the life of a typical Amazon Web Services customer. We don't have that approach at Wasabi. If we want to be successful in getting to the point of commoditization cloud storage service, you need to make it very simple in terms of how much you store, the price per gigabyte per month, and you end up with a number. That's it. Okay, so no extra junk fees or junk charges. So again, this is really how we're going to be successful in the commoditization of cloud storage. So why do we think the current AWS dominance won't win in the end? And a lot of this is driven by the age of multi-cloud. So I know for many of you that haven't really started doing anything with the cloud today, the concept of using multiple cloud providers may seem years off, but it's actually happening in terms of Gartner is really driving the education of this and the benefits of it. And so we have many customers that might keep a primary copy of their data in AWS or Azure or GCP. But when it comes to storing that secondary copy of the data, the fact that we're able to do it at 80% less than the big three hyperscalers makes a meaningful difference for them. So this is one of these trends that's going to pick up over time as more and more people embrace the cloud for their compute and storage use cases. So one of the messages that Amazon like to talk about, they say, their mission is that your data center in our cloud. And don't let me kid you in terms of, despite the fact that we're always kind of poking at them sometimes, it's a very powerful collection of services in terms of what they're able to do from a compute perspective and all the other complementary services to go around with it. But really what you think about is that Wasabi, we're just focused on storage in terms of we're not trying to offer all these different complementary services. So we have many customers that continue to use Amazon Web Services for compute applications and the other complementary services. But the fact that we are 100% compatible with the Amazon Web Services S3 API means you can continue to run your applications in Amazon Compute, and you can use that to interface with Wasabi Storage. And the fact that we're able to do that at 80% less price is really a game changer for a lot of the companies we're working with today. So Wasabi's value proposition for our customers really centers on three pillars. Certainly price, we've talked a lot about that in terms of 80% less than the industry benchmark from a Amazon Web Services S3 perspective, no charge for egress or data transfer out of the storage environment. And if you've ever looked at cloud storage, the industry trend is that data you send to the cloud is always free, but when you try to pull it out, they want to charge you. So it's kind of clever in a way in terms of it's like the old Roach motels. You can go in, but you can't get out without any pain or penalty. No API charges. From a performance perspective, some of the innovations we've done on the technology side of things gives us 6 times faster write performance relative to Amazon Web Services. And why is this important? Because if you're starting to talk about moving applications from a premises environment to a cloud environment, you want to be concerned that you're not taking a step backward from a speed perspective. It's also very important in backup and recovery use cases where the fact that you'll be able to write the data to the cloud and recover it back as fast as possible, that makes a huge difference in how quickly you can restore service. Another important trend in the use of cloud today is that certainly you can interface with any cloud service over the public network, but there's also increased adoption of private direct connect services. So Amazon has something called Direct Connect. We also have a similar service from Wasabi. So this is cases where you can connect your data center into Wasabi's data centers over private network connections. So this gives you another degree of performance and security. And then lastly, what we focus on at Wasabi in our goal to commoditize cloud storage are scale. I mean, one of the benefits of leveraging the cloud is that you don't have to buy storage in increments where maybe you don't have to buy like 5 or 10 or 20 terabytes over time. The cloud grows with you. That's a very important part of what we do. And then the data durability. So certainly when you think about your premises storage environments in terms of, part of the reason why you have multiple copies of the data in your premise storage environment because you're always concerned about data loss. The model with cloud storage, particularly with Wasabi, is you send us a file, we copy it 20 times to different server targets in our storage vaults. So that way, if you ever have a problem at the disk level or the server level, you're protected against that. We also support a feature known as cross-region replication. So if you want to copy the storage from our data center in the East Coast or our data center in the West Coast, you have that option. Another important capability of cloud storage that we're able to offer is immutability. So this protects against accidental deletion and modification and malware and all those other evil things. So for the duration of the time you set to retain the data, you're protected against that. And then compliance and security in terms of, so cloud storage vendors like Wasabi, we've made a huge investment in getting certified for HIPAA and criminal justice and higher education, all the relevant industry standards. So again, this is very important if we're going to be successful in evolving cloud storage to become a commodity. Certainly security as well in terms of one of the things when you think about security, sometimes people say, well, I'm not sure if my organization is ready to embrace cloud storage because I'm concerned about the security. And everything done in cloud storage, all the transmission is done using HTTPS, so same as other web transactions. Wasabi, along with most other cloud storage providers, supports something called data at rest encryption. So we encrypt the data when it resides in our data centers. You're also welcome to use the encryption capabilities that exist in most storage applications as well. So a couple good industry examples that have benefited from Wasabi's approach to commoditizing cloud storage. One of our largest customers is a company called IQ Media. They focus on real-time brand impact measurements. This customer stores about 4 petabytes with us today. And their challenge was, how can you store these petabytes at a lower cost than you'd be able to achieve on a premises environment? Because ultimately, the CTO of this one company was like, we want it out of the storage business, meaning it's not a core capability we want to maintain. And the fact that we were able to migrate their storage from a premise environment to a cloud environment in a very cost-effective manner, this is ultimately a good testimony to the success that we've had in commoditizing cloud storage. Another good industry example is a company called Seven Wonders Cinema. They are focused on video production. We do a lot of work with Hollywood in those studios because when you think about all the data, like in terms of just like a full-length picture alone, in terms of how many hundreds of terabytes all that requires for all the copies and editing that takes place. And so for this customer, they were very concerned about archiving, disaster recovery, and backups. And for them, it was really about reliable, affordable, long-term cloud storage. And they originally were looking at Amazon Web Services S3, and they just struggled with all the different tiers and the complexity associated with that. So the fact that we're able to deliver a simple, commoditized pricing model to them was very valuable, and it's a good example of many customers we've been able to help in a similar manner. So I'll kind of finish up with just some other use cases that are enabled by storage commoditization. So yeah, I think the last 2 customers are kind of good examples in the media and entertainment segment in terms of how you're able to use commoditized cloud storage for content development, archiving, and delivery. We talked earlier about the Internet of Things and all the data that's going to produce. Well, that needs to be stored somewhere. It needs to be stored in a cost-effective manner. It needs to be stored in a manner that can be delivered very quickly to the devices and the aggregation elements that want to get it back. So that's another good use case for us. Government education, we talked about the body camera example, but even anything to do with government organizations that need to keep data around for a very long period of time. So the fact that we're able to deliver storage capabilities, hot storage capabilities, meaning you'll get it back very quickly at cold storage prices, has been quite a disruptor relative to keeping this data on tapes, for example. Scientific research, we talked about the genomics industry in terms of how much data is getting created from that environment. Same thing with healthcare and life sciences. We're working with a number of radiological imaging companies in terms of storing all x-rays and other types of data in the cloud. Again, with our pricing and our performance, these are our capabilities that perhaps were not leveraged before because the cost points weren't there and the performance points weren't there. So again, what we're doing is really helping drive that going forward. So just to kind of summarize, I think when we focus on the commoditization of cloud storage, anytime you drop the price of anything by 80%, it really is a driver for change. And certainly the work we're doing at Wasabi and driving cloud storage 2.0 going forward is truly changing the game as it pertains to how you store elements and data in the cloud. So that's it for my prepared remarks. I guess at this point, Roger, we have a few minutes for some questions from the floor. I'm going to count on my colleagues, George and Evan, perhaps, to start things off here.
Where are we? Do we have questions? Somewhere.
We got one on the wall over there. Roger, sorry to make you...
No, it's all right. Oh, there we are. No, we have to. We're recording, so we like to get it so that everybody gets to hear.
So, what kind of tool sets can you provide to take the storage from a cloud provider to Wasabi? I know you mentioned Direct Connect, but that's from on-prem. So, how do you?
I'm sorry. What was the question?
So, how do you facilitate taking the data that's currently on a cloud provider, one of the 3, to Wasabi?
Good question. So. This comes up sometimes, especially in a multi-cloud context. So there's the business side of how you would do it, and there's the technical side of how you would do it. So you're starting to see an increase of third-party providers that kind of perform a cloud-to-cloud migration service, okay? There's literally a half dozen that I can think of. No necessarily big brand names at this point. I mean, one of the things you'll find is that tools like Microsoft Azure provide something called AZ Copy, and this is a utility you can run in Azure that lets you suck data out of S3 and then bring it over, and there's third parties that will do this as well. The challenge on the business side associated with that is that anytime you pull the data, let's just say out of S3 into another cloud, AWS S3 will want to charge you an exit fee. Okay, so you're essentially going to pay between 5 to 9 cents per gigabyte to get the data out. So sometimes that eats into the cost that you're going to save by bringing it to Wasabi. It certainly doesn't neutralize it, but it does eat into it. And then these third-party services will often want to take their bite of the apple, so to speak, and because they're an application that's running in cloud compute, they have their fees, so they'll start to charge you on a per gigabyte or per terabyte basis for the use of that function. So customers will often, rather than try to pull it out of the old cloud and then send it to Wasabi, from the application that's sending it to S3, for example, they will basically fork it and just send another copy from the application to us. Because in many ways, especially as part of a multi-cloud strategy where you keep the primary copy in AWS S3 and a secondary copy in Wasabi, it's less about migration, it's more about continuous duplication. So it's not just that, it's not the technical part is relatively easy, but just how you account for the costs of migrating from cloud A to cloud B is always a factor. But great question, thank you.
Great. Are there other questions? Yeah, in the back. We'll do it.
I'm going to find one in the front row for you next, Roger, so you can come back up here. So.
Thank you. So the Amazons and the Azures, a lot of their lock-in is tied to PaaS development, where you're able to develop apps on that.
Yes.
So from your standpoint, how do you compete with them on that space?
Great question. You're like my setup guy, okay? Because when I talked earlier
Very
about
good.
the commoditization of our storage service and the importance of APIs, all right? So the fact that Wasabi did a bit compatible implementation with the S3 API means that if you've already developed your application, particularly in an AWS environment, so you've probably used one of their dozens of SDKs they make available for JavaScript, Ruby, Python, those sort of things. So you can literally use those same SDKs. You just change the service URL in the configuration to point to Wasabi. We have hundreds of customers that have done this. Now, it's a little bit more of a challenge in an Azure environment because Azure uses a different API, but anything you're doing with applications that are running in AWS or GCP, those basically come right over into Wasabi. But great question.
Other questions? I know some people like to pose them privately, not in front of everyone, so thanks for attending, and my disembodied voice right now for the people who are watching, thanks for watching, and if you have more questions, please feel free to approach us.
All right, thanks everyone. Thanks, Roger.
Thank you.